And then it's going to be very interesting to see if there is a meeting in Moscow or wherever of all three, Putin, Zelensky, and Trump, or even Zelensky, Sergei Lavrov, and Rubio, how poisonous, how dynamite-like that meeting is going to be. And we'll see the true Zelensky there, probably. And I would predict that it will be a very harsh, brutal meeting if it occurs. And it may not occur because other people will anticipate that. But that would be the showdown. That would be the showdown and the ultimate put down for Zelensky, because there's no way he's going to stand up in Russian, in English, in Ukrainian against that triumvirate, if you will. Even if Trump is not there, maybe, in Lavrov and one of Putin's emissaries other than Lavrov, or whatever might be the final meeting. I can't imagine that they're going to go Zelensky, Putin, and Trump. I just can't imagine that. The enmity between them is so raw and great. I would find it hard. People have sat down in history, though, before, who were at sword point 24 hours before. So it could happen. And he would rescue his reputation, if you will, in the world, in Europe, in history, were he to be suddenly a very well-informed, capable diplomat and get the best deal he possibly could. That would be his best approach. But so far from what I've seen from Zelensky, he's incapable of doing that. Elevating Zelensky to that point would probably be a huge mistake. And you would probably have Zelensky proving it was a huge mistake within 10 minutes of the meeting convening. So I don't know how they're going to do that. I don't know what the architecture of the meetings are going to be. I don't know how he's going to bring Zelensky in. I think Trump has said he's going to let Zelensky come. Is it going to be a trilateral meeting with the three leaders there, or is it just going to be Trump and Putin, and Zelensky will meet with Rubio and Lavrov? I don't know. But that's potential for dynamite too. Toward the end of the last year of the Biden administration, I don't remember the exact date, but Jake Sullivan actually made an accurate statement about the Ukraine conflict when he said some words to the effect of, they just don't have the manpower. They don't have the men. Bingo. Then why were you continuing the war? Unless you were prepared to put men on the battlefield, American troops, British troops, French troops, whatever. Unless you were prepared to do that, why would you make that statement, which was perfectly accurate, and continue the war? And yet they did. And that's Zelensky's problem. He cannot grow men. They have one of the smallest militaries of any power that talks the way Starmer talks, or for that matter, the way other British prime ministers have talked in the last few years on the face of the earth. They have fewer puissance, as the French would say, fewer real power to back it up. Mr. Starmer, everything you just said is a farce, just like before when you said you'd put troops on the ground in Ukraine, but then backed up and said only if the U.S. would guarantee their security. So you're still saying the same thing, and what you're saying is feckless. And what a tone-deaf ear to politics. Coalition of the willing? Doesn't he know we lost with the coalition of the willing? Right. He started well and he ended well if you think about trying to put Ukraine in the best possible position for negotiations. But he didn't end well, and he particularly didn't end well when he said all those powerful words he uttered would only count if the United States essentially signed the deal and gave him an ironclad commitment. They're not going to do that. Now, let's set up the negotiations, let's get going, and let's quit all the talk about how we're going to do this or do that for Ukraine, because the war's over and Russia has won. And you're going to have to reach an agreement whereby, and this is what really worries me about Trump being part of this, he's not going to like this, I don't think, unless he's a bigger man than I think. It's going to largely look like a Russian win. And for all intents and purposes, it probably should, after all. They've been the ones fighting. They've been the ones bleeding. Now, Ukraine's been fighting and bleeding too, and I commend them for that. But it's over. It's finished, and the bigger man won. And at the end of the day, Zelensky needed to hear that. I'm not sure he still understands what was being said, though. I'm not sure he understands that Biden, Sullivan, and Blinken, Blinken, and nod, I call them, led him down the primrose path. And they led him down that path. I have to think, because they aren't stupid people, they knew they were going to wind up at a point like this, but they thought they were going to bleed Russia mercilessly before they got to that point, even to the point of maybe coming to an agreement that would be much more beneficial for Kyiv than the one they're going to get. Your question about Zelensky, I feel sorry for the guy for only one reason, because I say for only one reason, because I can't find any other reasons, because I know the Ukrainians. I dealt with them from 2002 to 2005. I know how corrupt they are. I know how they should never have even been thought of for NATO, not for at least 10 years. They couldn't pass the criterion test. But look, we let Albania in, we let Montenegro in. So it didn't mean any difference. That's the Biden administration. That's the Obama administration. That's the Clinton administration. They all did that. And George W. Bush did it too. It's such a blatant show of whom Trump is talking to. He's not talking to the American people. He's talking to the MAGA boys and girls. The American people, 3/4 of them at least, even the 90 million who didn't cast a vote, are appalled. Absolutely appalled. And I suspect even some of the MAGA people are appalled. But the root of his cult is excited. They're ecstatic. And that's who he was talking to. And he knows that. He knows that's who he was talking to. That's all I can say about those people who otherwise I would have to say belong in an insane asylum. But they're the guilty party. And that's one thing Trump indirectly said, but he didn't say it dramatically and directly, and he should have. And I would said it in private, but you are the previous American administration's tool, Mr. Zelensky. I know you don't believe that, but you will come to believe that, because they were using you to bleed Russia. And they used millions of your people to bleed Russia, some of whom are now dead. Zelensky is a tool of Biden's peak, a tool of Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken's peak and lack of diplomatic credentials and lack of strategic grasp. That's what Zelensky is. They confronted each other in a way that was not necessary, but if it had been in private and done diplomatically and a little bit differently, I think, it might have had the same shock effect on the person that should have the shock effect, Zelensky, and it might have led to some mea culpas and some words that would get into the business of solving the situation with as little rancor as possible, and maybe even attenuate some of what was going to happen with people like and Macron and perhaps others too. But it's done. It's a done deal. It was very inartfully done, very undiplomatically done, but it's a done deal. And I wouldn't have faulted Trump for saying that in private. I might not even have faulted him for saying what I just said about Biden and Blinken and I didn't nudge in public, because the American people need to hear that. We were ill-served for 4 years by a Democratic administration, and thank you very much. We now have another administration because of that, at least in part. And let's don't have any more administrations like Lincoln, Blinken, and not. I think Europe will mature, grow up, and form its own security architecture, which the United States might be willing to come into, especially with its nuclear shield, and guarantee that architecture in that regard. And that if diplomacy and good leadership is brought to bear on the problem, we can have a better situation, because we're moving into a multipolar world, and NATO is an obsolete vestige of the former world. Worse than that, it is a current vestige of America's now failed attempt to post-Cold War make it a unipolar world. The ultimate dissolution of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and possibly even America's breaking, severing, whatever verb you want to use, the transatlantic link. The purpose of NATO was very eloquently put by a general officer at the time. I think it was an American general officer. It was to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and Russia out. None of those things are that relevant today, including keeping the Americans in. I think outside the fact that he made it a public confrontation, and of all things in the Oval Office to boot, it probably was a necessary attack. And I applaud him for it. Not the ostentation and the doing it the way he did in the office and having J.D. Vance sort of help, but the fact that he said what he said and did what he did, I think, was positive. So I think we're at a difficult point right now to move down the road to where we're going to go with Putin, and ultimately, as I understand it now, that Trump has agreed that somewhere along the way, Zelensky will be a partner in the peace talks. I hardly call them peace talks anymore. The talks to stop the war in Ukraine, that'd be a more apt description. Now, some of the things that they're doing in reaction to just that meeting and just the bold nature of that meeting, the public nature of that meeting, are very dangerous. Not the least of which was the initial promise by Macron to fly nuclear weapons into Germany and even into Ukraine, and Starmer's following up with that. Now, had he not prepared Starmer and Macron and others for what he was going to do? Probably not. And I don't necessarily fault him for that, but I probably would have given them a near simultaneous earshot so they would know at least that this was coming and it was going to be so public and not at all in a diplomatic sense, quiet, to the point, and then some very carefully parsed paragraphs issued afterwards by both sides. Nonetheless, the effect would still be there because the meeting would have happened in private and it would have been as consequential as it was in public, but without all the brouhaha. And you really made Starmer and Macron mad, which wouldn't bother me, but ought to bother the President of the United States. So I don't know that we're set up as well as we could be set up, but I am happy and pleased that we're going towards apparently diplomacy with the Russians, meaningful diplomacy with the Russians, and that part of that diplomacy, if not a large part initially, is going to be to shut the war down, which means stopping all the munitions going in, stopping all the money going in, and maybe bending some elbows in Europe to get them to more or less comport themselves in the same way, because they certainly are not doing that now. And they still have the potential to make this a very dicey situation if they get in a position where Putin feels like he's got to react. Starmer leads a pipsqueak country. Macron does not lead a pipsqueak country, but he leads a country that is without a political system that empowers its leaders. Certainly right now, he's a dead man walking. So here he is speaking for the nation of France, and he's not speaking for the nation of France. So those two examples that we might select, and you could pick Germany too, because we now have Friedrich Merz, who is no better than Stolz in terms of representing the majority of the German people, and yet he's going to lead Germany. And he's probably going to lead it pretty much the same way Stolz did. So what we have in Europe right now, even in powerful countries like Germany, potentially powerful countries like France, and pipsqueaks like England, Britain, is bad leadership and terribly bad leadership. London thinks it's still running an empire, and it lusts after that empire. It's a pipsqueak on the world scene. It's a pipsqueak. Its military forces are pipsqueak. Its might, other than financial perhaps, and a lot of that is wrapped up in laundering dirty money, is pipsqueakish. But it could be very dangerous, just like this business of Macron saying he's going to fly nuclear weapons into Germany and into Ukraine, and Starmer saying, I think I will too. That's very dangerous. And Zelensky, I don't know if he realizes that he's playing with that, but he certainly realizes he's playing with people who can muck the matters up. And that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to get something started with key members of NATO that'll make the United States rethink its position. That's what he's trying to do. And I think he's in desperate straits in trying that, and I think he's going to fail. He's in no position to make those kinds of statements. He can make them if he wants to, but all he's doing is revealing how increasingly inept he is. Here for Trump, Trump is absolutely right. You are in no position to make such statements. You are in no position to carry out your threat. So why don't you just shut up? I think that's what we got. I do think that's what we got. And so you don't need any grasp of history or detail. You just blunder your way through the present and hope that the future is taken care of by the power with which you're blundering your way through the present. I hate to say it, but since 9/11, we've had quite a few presidents like that. Obama being the one exception probably, but in the end, Obama even turned into a person who was captured by the warfare state, if you will. But you recall those statements back there. I would have brought some of those out in a private diplomatic meeting. If you want to talk about Obama, Obama essentially said, we wouldn't start a war in the heart of Europe with Russia over Ukraine. It'd be stupid. It'd be idiotic. And he was right. And oh, by the way, they did have a plebiscite in Crimea. And you have two conclusions you can come to for that. One, it's as you suggest, they don't know what they're talking about. They really have not studied anything. They only study the moment and what it means for their political future. That's all they study. Or two, they did know it. And J.D. Vance gives me the impression that perhaps he does know a lot of the history and the detail, and they don't want to talk about it. They just simply want to start from the point where Donald Trump was elected president of the United States and go on from there. And they don't do the past. They don't do history. That's very typical of Americans. What we do is the immediate moment, and that's what we do all throughout the day. There are two possibilities there, though. If had they done it diplomatically, that is to say, in private quarters behind closed doors, and nonetheless got rather testy about it, they could have still been just as testy as they were, but a little more informed, as you're saying. Had they done it that way, then it might have been very effective. It might have been extremely effective, and it might have got Zelensky to thinking about which direction he needed to go, even to the point where he would call elections and have a new leader put in place. I would, were I he. But it didn't happen that way. It's a very corporate attitude, too, if you think about it for a moment. Corporations don't look back on the past much either. When they do, they're rare. They simply make the decisions on a day-to-day basis. They look to the future sometimes, but mostly they look to the future for those stock gains and those stock options. They're not looking at it for the integrity of their country or the long-lived nature of their company, just the profit. But will Donald Trump do anything about this? That takes me back to the original point I made when we were talking about Ukraine. This is why it looks so strange to me. This man is supposed to be so opposed to war, so much a peacemaker, if you will, so much a transactional president that he understands that war doesn't transact very well, not in economic terms, not in financial terms, leaves you hellaciously in debt. Why is he so in favor of this one and so in disfavor of the other one? I've got to conclude it's because they're doing what we want them to do. And I don't necessarily mean Donald Trump by the we. He's in those people's hands. And those people are the Jewish billionaires and others, billionaires who aren't Jewish, who support what's going on in the Levant and support Israel for doing it. People like Lindsey Graham. Notice how Lindsey switched on a dime about Ukraine. This is Lindsey. This is my South Carolinian friend. That's a coward. That's a political chameleon coward. Call it whatever you want. And that's what Lindsey is. But nonetheless, you listen to him from time to time and you hear where the waves are washing up on the shore. You know where Trump is going, where Lindsey's going, and more importantly than all that, a little bit about where the Republican Party's going. To give Lindsey credit, and I hate to do it, the only thing Lindsey is concerned about is Donald Trump's ability to get him unelected. So he is going to fold himself into Donald Trump's back pocket no matter what Donald Trump does or says. He'll figure out a way to make it sound a little bit like he's not a turncoat, especially to his South Carolinian voters. But he knows damn well if he makes Trump angry, he will be voted out of office very shortly. But I don't see Trump listening. I just don't. I see him blundering on through whatever it is he has to do that he feels like he has to do, and he's doing it the way he feels like he has to do it. The Zelensky meeting is a case in point. I'm waiting for that rift to start. I'm waiting for something to begin to happen within my political party that tells me that these people out there who are getting their notices and who have mortgages, children in university, car payments, and other things, and many of them are at that point, say 40 years old, 41 years old, whatever, and they really don't have other options right in front of them. I'm wondering when they're going to start calling their congressman and their senator and telling them, and in many cases, these are in red states, telling them how unhappy they are with what Trump is doing, and especially with what Elon Musk is doing, and how that's going to erode the Republican majority to the point where they lose the midterms. I'm not sure that's going to make any difference if these Trumpians are really planning on a coup, which more and more of my colleagues out there are beginning to think they are. But if it's to be a regular administration, as it were, and end in 4 years, and the midpoint is going to be a dicey thing for them, you would think they would begin to pay attention. You would think they would be listening. Netanyahu has never wanted to go to phase 2. Netanyahu wants to resume fighting. And while he's doing that, he's brought the West Bank to a new level of violence, killing, plunder, dispossession of property, routing out people and forcing them out. He's finishing off the West Bank. And Netanyahu is going to say that. He's going to say it over and over again. Then when they don't get them back, he's going to say it was Hamas's fault. And oh, by the way, he's also now so deep into Syria that we have burbles in Damascus and words coming out of Damascus that might tell you that they might put their act together here pretty shortly and oppose Israel. You also have a gentleman up there in the northern part of Syria who's just concluded a pretty good deal with the leader of the Kurds that he's opposed to. That settled, we're looking at the possibility of Erdogan giving Damascus a little bit of help. You're talking about the IDF being somewhat demoralized, been defeated by Hamas in Gaza, taking out its vengeance, as Netanyahu has directed it to do, on the West Bank citizens, wreaking havoc there, just as they were in Gaza. You've also got other people in the region who might even pitch in. Iraq comes to mind immediately. At the same time, you've got el-Sisi and you've got King Abdullah sitting on armored forces that might move at any moment. And you've got Lebanon to worry about, too, because Lebanon does not want Israel to continue to do what it's doing right now, which is violating the ceasefire and not honoring the ceasefire and staying in Lebanon ad nauseum. Israel could be in a real pickle here very shortly, and Netanyahu will have no one to blame but his own audacious, arrogant, unstrategic self. He's doubling down on the West Bank right now. He's going to make sure that there are no Palestinians left when he's finished on the West Bank. He's got all the land. He's moving aggressively into Syria. He's almost put an edict out, as it were, over the entire swath that Israel is influencing right now, which is much of the south of Syria, that no one should operate in there because they'll be hit by the IDF if they do. You just can't. The going in position for us is you have failed. For 70 plus, since 1947-48, you have failed. You, Israel, you, both sides, Hamas, Palestinian Authority, Israeli government, you have failed. You do not want peace. You want perpetual war. You want perpetual war. You lust for perpetual war. We don't like that. The region doesn't like that. The world doesn't like that. Let's stop. We're going to come in. We're going to vote in a constitution. You don't even have a constitution, you little pipsqueak. Neither one of you. We're going to have a constitution. Oh, guess what our constitution says? There has to be separation between church and state. That's what our constitution says. Here's what I would suggest. We've been doing this for 2 years. We've been actually longer than 2 years. As I read it, I've been involved with it for 2 years. We've been simulating every other Sunday an Israeli-Palestinian confederation. This is very simple. There are roughly 14 million people between the river and the sea, roughly half and half, although there are a few more Palestinians or others than there are Jewish citizens. Let's have an election online. Let's get at least 5 or 6 million people to vote. Let's elect a parliament of 300, 50% of which will be Palestinian Arab, 50% will be Jewish Israeli. They'll all be Israeli citizens. And that parliament will rule over the government of Israel and or whatever gets called the government of Palestine in the interim, and pass legislation that's aimed at peace, not at war, because these two governments are completely unacceptable in that vein. They do not want peace, either one of them. They want perpetual war, both of them. Hamas, too, if you pull them into the formula. We have all the Israelites, Israelis. We have all of these people participating. We have Knesset members, former Knesset members, who participate in these deliberations. It could work. It needs to be tried. We think we could conduct the election for about the cost of 1 day of war. And we think we could get 5 to 6 million to vote of the registered voters amongst those 14 million. Everyone who's a citizen would be given the right to vote. And the only people that would be accepted would be people underage. Everyone else could vote. Nobody could vote from the diaspora. None of those could vote. Just people living in and holding Israeli citizenship. Let's have a federal government with a constitution over both of those governments, and that federal government will bring peace. That's the kind of solution we need. We know from doing these simulations every other Sunday for years that you can do it, that it can work. We have all manner of Palestinians, all manner of Jews, all manner of Israelites on both sides. Now, that's a solution. That's a solution that would work. These other things are just pie in the sky, I think. So I would say it's doomed to failure. It'll get a lot of mouth. It might even get a lot of money, especially from Riyadh. But I would say it was doomed to failure because I've never seen, since Lawrence of Arabia, I've not seen anything work for Arab states in this sort of fashion. Neither the Arab League, the Gulf Cooperation Council, or any individual Arab state, bar none, have a brilliant track record at such things. And you get different opinions and views about whether it would work in the long run. Almost everyone is supportive, Palestinian and Israeli, and neither. We had some Christians from Nazareth, for example. The Nazareth area, most people don't know this, the Nazareth area is really probably more Christian, more Arab, more Christian, more other than it is Jewish. It's one of the regions that has quite a polyglot of a population, for example. I like to play that region when I play a member of the parliament in the simulations because it gives me so much more perspective and so much more challenge to represent all of the people in that region because they're not all Jews, they're not all Palestinian Arabs and so forth. We've had people from the other side of the aisle too, though, and we've had some pretty tough Israelis on there who really let us know what they think. And we've had some Palestinians on there who are not necessarily predisposed to peace, but by and large, more Palestinians are predisposed to peace than are Israelis, which tells you something too. But we've had quite a few people, I can send you a copy of the list, who participate, and quite a few people who we have the usual crowd from the progressive side, the left side. Noam Chomsky, for example, has a video extolling what we do. Wholly different government, interested in peace, interested in bringing peace about and making the other government so embarrassed in the process that they eventually go along.